He found the frozen bear on the mountain. When he thought it out. Have you ever been so close to death that even the cold around you felt alive? Jack Sullivan hadn't planned on climbing Mount Denali alone that February. No one in their right mind would. The storms were ruthless, the temperatures could kill in minutes, and the isolation was the kind that broke even the toughest minds. But Jack wasn't climbing for the thrill, he was running. The weight of his past bore down heavier than the survival pack on his back. Every step up the mountain was an attempt to escape the faces that haunted him, a wife he couldn't save, a son he hadn't seen in years. Jack thought the summit might offer absolution, or at the very least, silence. But fate had other plans. It was on the third day, when the wind screamed like a banshee and the frostbitten edges of his gloves clung desperately to an ice pick, that Jack saw it. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, an illusion cast by exhaustion and the unrelenting snow. But as he moved closer, the shape became clearer. A bear. A massive grizzly, encased in a thick sheet of ice, as though it had been frozen mid-motion. Its glassy eyes stared into nothingness, its body unnaturally preserved, like a prehistoric relic pulled straight from the Ice Age. Jack's heart thundered. What the hell was a bear doing here, at this altitude, in this condition? Instinct screamed at him to leave it alone. But something about the bear's frozen, sorrowful expression stopped him. Against all logic, Jack took out his ice axe and began chipping away at the icy prison. As the hours passed, the storm calmed, as though the mountain itself was watching. The ice gave way slowly, revealing matted fur and claws the size of knives. Jack's breath fogged the air, his hands shaking from both the cold and the weight of what he was doing. Finally, with the bear's chest fully exposed, Jack leaned in to examine its frozen form, and then he saw it. A scar. Deep, jagged, and unmistakably man-made, slashed across the bear's chest. Jack stumbled backward, his mind racing. Who had done this? And what? Before he could answer those questions, the unthinkable happened. A faint sound echoed from the bear. A growl. Jack froze, his blood running colder than the ice around him. He stared at the bear in disbelief, his pulse hammering in his ears. The impossible had just become reality. The bear was alive. The growl was faint but unmistakable, a low vibration that sent a jolt of terror through Jack's body. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the icy ground. How could the bear be alive? The creature had been frozen solid, its body encased in a prison of ice, immovable and lifeless. And yet, there it was. Breathing. Jack crouched down, his breath fogging the frigid air as he watched the bear's chest rise and fall ever so slightly. His gloved hand hovered over the handle of his ice axe, ready to defend himself if the situation turned. But the bear didn't move beyond that faint, rhythmic rise and fall of its ribcage. It wasn't fully conscious, and Jack realized that whatever life still flickered inside the beast was fragile, hanging on by a thread. Why hadn't he left it alone? Every logical part of his brain chastised him. Climbing Mount Denali alone was dangerous enough without involving a half-frozen predator that could wake up and rip him apart. And yet, staring at the creature's massive, scarred body, Jack felt something he hadn't expected: pity. The scar that slashed across its chest wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had hurt this animal. The thought made his stomach twist. Jack pulled off his glove and reached out cautiously, his fingertips brushing the frozen fur. It was coarse, stiff with frost, and colder than death. He felt the faint pulse beneath the surface, a weak but undeniable reminder that life still lingered inside this giant. He knew he couldn't leave it here, not like this. The rational part of his mind fought back. What was he supposed to do? Drag a 900-pound grizzly down the mountain? He wasn't a hero in some nature documentary. He was just a man, barely surviving himself. But something deep inside wouldn't let him walk away. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was insanity. Or maybe it was the tiny part of him that still believed he could make amends for the lives he'd failed to save. Jack rummaged through his pack, pulling out his emergency thermal blanket. It was laughably small compared to the bear's hulking form, but it was all he had. He draped it over the creature's chest, tucking it around the exposed areas as best he could. Then he set up his portable stove and melted snow into water, pouring the lukewarm liquid carefully into the bear's mouth. Most of it spilled out, but a small amount seemed to trickle down its throat. As night fell, Jack built a crude shelter around the bear using his tent and some nearby rocks. The wind howled outside, but the space inside the makeshift enclosure was surprisingly still. He sat beside the bear, watching its slow, shallow breaths and wondering if he'd completely lost his mind. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the occasional gust of wind or the eerie silence of the mountain. Each time Jack stirred, his eyes went to the bear, half expecting it to have vanished or awakened. But it remained as it was, alive, yet unmoving. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside sparkling with fresh snow. Jack stepped out of the shelter, his breath catching at the beauty of the sunlit landscape. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, until he heard the sound. A crunch of snow behind him. He spun around, heart racing, to find the bear stirring. Its massive head moved slightly, and its eyes, dark, piercing and undeniably alive, opened. They locked onto Jack, and for a moment, neither man nor beast moved. Jack's hand instinctively went to his ice axe, but he didn't raise it. He couldn't. The bear didn't look angry or aggressive. It looked confused. "Hey," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The bear blinked slowly, its body trembling as it tried to rise. But it was too weak, collapsing back onto the snow with a low groan. Jack hesitated, then knelt down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He poured more water into his hand and extended it toward the bear. It sniffed cautiously, then lapped up the water with a rough, sandpaper-like tongue. Jack couldn't believe what he was doing. Here he was, alone on one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, nursing a wounded grizzly bear back to health. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm, like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the day wore on, Jack tended to the bear, feeding it scraps of jerky and bits of energy bars from his pack. The creature's strength seemed to return gradually, though it remained weak and docile. Jack found himself talking to it, his voice filling the otherwise silent air. "I don't know what happened to you," he said, running a hand through his frost-bitten hair. "But I've got my scars too." The bear's eyes met his, and for a moment, Jack swore it understood him. What neither of them knew was that the true danger was still to come, and it wouldn't come from the mountain. By the third day, the bear was no longer just a curiosity or a burden. It was a companion, albeit an unpredictable one. Jack had named it Ghost, partly because of its spectral appearance against the snow, and partly because it seemed to embody everything he'd been running from: loss, survival, and the haunting weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Ghost's strength had returned enough for it to stand, though its movements were slow and unsteady. Jack kept his distance, careful not to provoke the animal. He'd read enough survival guides to know that trust was a dangerous thing to offer a wild predator, but there was something in Ghost's eyes that made him feel safe. It wasn't aggression that filled those dark, glassy depths. It was exhaustion. A quiet, mutual understanding that they were both trying to survive. The scar across Ghost's chest remained a mystery, its jagged edges too precise to be the work of another animal. Jack's thoughts kept circling back to it as they descended the mountain together. He couldn't shake the feeling that the scar wasn't just a wound, it was a message. But from who? Or what? On the fourth day, Jack spotted movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was another climber, a dark figure cutting through the blinding whiteness of the snow. Relief flickered in his chest at the thought of encountering another human being, but as he adjusted his binoculars, that relief turned to dread. The figure wasn't a climber. It was too deliberate, too calculated in its movements. And it wasn't alone. There were two of them, dressed in black tactical gear that stood out starkly against the snow. Their faces were obscured by masks, and they carried rifles slung over their shoulders. Jack's stomach twisted. Who the hell were they? Ghost seemed to sense the shift in Jack's demeanor. The bear's ears twitched, and it let out a low growl, its massive body tensing as it sniffed the air. Jack crouched down, his mind racing. Were these men looking for him? Or for Ghost? Either way, it didn't bode well. Jack grabbed Ghost's fur and whispered, "Stay low. We need to move." As if the bear understood him, it sank onto its haunches, its eyes fixed on the approaching figures. Jack led them off the trail, his boots crunching softly against the snow as he veered toward a dense cluster of rocks. The makeshift cover wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The men were getting closer. Jack could hear their voices now, muffled but clear enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "Not supposed to be here. Doesn't matter. Orders are orders. Think it's still alive?" Jack's breath hitched. They were talking about Ghost. His heart pounded as he tried to piece together what little information he had. These weren't random climbers or rescue workers. They were hunters. Maybe not the kind who wore camouflage and waited in tree stands, but hunters all the same. And they weren't here by accident. Ghost let out another low growl, and Jack clamped a hand over its snout. The bear's eyes darted toward him, and for a terrifying moment, Jack thought it might lash out. But then it stilled, as though understanding the danger. The men were close now, their boots crunching in the snow just a few yards away. Jack pressed himself against the cold rock, his breath shallow as he listened. "You see the tracks?" one of them said. "Yeah, big, fresh. We're close. You think the climber's with it? Doesn't matter. If he's seen it, he's a liability." Jack's blood ran cold. Whoever these men were, they weren't just after Ghost. They were after anyone who stood in their way. He tightened his grip on his ice axe, his mind racing through options. Running would make noise. Fighting was suicide. But staying put meant they'd eventually find him and Ghost. None of the options felt like survival. The sound of crunching snow grew louder, closer. Jack peeked around the edge of the rock and saw one of the men just a few feet away, his rifle slung casually across his chest. The other was scanning the horizon, his hand resting on a sidearm. They looked like they belonged in a military operation, not on the side of a frozen mountain. Jack's heart pounded as he calculated his next move. But before he could act, Ghost did. With a roar that echoed across the mountainside, the bear surged forward, its massive body colliding with the nearest man. The force sent him sprawling into the snow, his rifle skidding out of reach. The second man spun around, his weapon raised, but Jack was faster. He swung his ice axe, knocking the rifle out of the man's hands before tackling him to the ground. The scene was chaos, snow flying, roars and shouts blending into a cacophony of survival. Ghost pinned the first man to the ground, its massive paw pressing against his chest as he screamed in terror. Jack wrestled with the second, adrenaline surging as he fought to keep the man's hands away from his sidearm. In the end, it was Ghost who ended the fight. With a final, bone-chilling roar, the bear released the man beneath its paw and stood, its towering form silhouetted against the snow. The hunters scrambled to their feet, their confidence shattered, and bolted down the mountain without looking back. Jack collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Ghost stood beside him, its body tense, but its eyes calm. "Thanks," Jack muttered, his voice shaky. He didn't know if he was talking to the bear or the universe itself. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Those men would be back. And Jack knew they'd bring more than rifles next time. The adrenaline still pulsed through Jack's veins as he and Ghost trudged through the snow, putting as much distance as possible between them and the scene of the fight. The bear walked beside him, its massive frame casting a shadow over the frozen ground. Jack didn't look back. He knew the men would return, and he wasn't planning to stick around long enough to find out how many reinforcements they'd bring. The questions swirling in Jack's mind grew heavier with each step. Who were those men? Why were they hunting Ghost? And what did they mean by liability? As much as Jack wanted to focus on survival, his curiosity gnawed at him. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than a random encounter in the wilderness. And somehow, he'd been dragged into it. They found shelter in a narrow crevice carved into the side of the mountain. The wind howled outside, but the space was tight enough to block most of the chill. Jack sat down on a boulder, his legs trembling from exhaustion. Ghost curled up nearby, its breathing deep and steady. The bear had returned to its docile state, as though the ferocious protector Jack had seen earlier was just a temporary mask. Jack's eyes drifted to the scar on Ghost's chest. In the dim light, He could see the details more clearly. The edges were jagged, but there was a precision to the wound that unsettled him. It wasn't the result of a fight with another animal, it had been inflicted with intent. Jack reached out slowly, his hand hovering over the scar. "What happened to you?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. Ghost didn't move, its dark eyes fixed on Jack with an almost human intensity. Jack's fingers brushed the edge of the scar, and a shiver ran through him. The wound wasn't fresh, but it hadn't fully healed either. It told a story of pain, resilience, and something else, something Jack couldn't quite name. He leaned back and pulled his pack closer, rummaging through its contents. His fingers brushed against the worn leather of his journal, and he hesitated. He hadn't opened it in months, not since the accident. But something about this moment compelled him. He pulled it out and flipped through the pages, his eyes skimming over the scribbled entries and half-finished sketches. The last entry hit him like a punch to the gut. February 5th, "I can't save everyone. But maybe I can save one." The words were messy, scrawled in a moment of desperation. Jack remembered writing them after the avalanche that had claimed his wife, Sarah, and left him buried in grief. He'd blamed himself for her death, for not being fast enough, strong enough, or brave enough. That guilt had driven him up this mountain, searching for something he couldn't name. And now here he was, face to face with a creature that seemed just as broken as he was. Jack closed the journal and stared at Ghost. The bear's breathing was slow and steady, its eyes half closed. He wondered if it understood the gravity of their situation, if it felt the same pull of fate that Jack did. Probably not, he thought. It's just an animal. But then Ghost shifted, turning its head to look at him, and Jack felt a pang of doubt. Maybe it wasn't just an animal. Maybe it was something more. The sound of footsteps outside shattered the moment. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled to his feet. Ghost rose too, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and growing closer. Jack grabbed his ice axe and pressed himself against the wall of the crevice, motioning for Ghost to stay low. A shadow passed over the entrance, and Jack held his breath. The figure stepped into view, and Jack's grip on the axe tightened. It wasn't one of the hunters. The man who stood before him was older, his face weathered by years of exposure to the elements. He wore a thick parka and carried a walking stick, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a level of awareness that made Jack uneasy. "Easy there," the man said, holding up a hand. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jack didn't lower the axe. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Name's Dr. Elias Monroe." Let's just say I'm someone who knows more about that bear than you do." Jack glanced at Ghost, who was watching Elias with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What do you want?" "To help," Elias said. He stepped closer, his gaze shifting to the scar on Ghost's chest. "You've gotten yourself involved in something you don't understand. That bear, it's not what you think it is." Jack frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elias sighed, his expression darkening. "That scar isn't just a wound. It's a mark, a sign that someone's been experimenting on it." Jack's stomach twisted. "Experimenting? Why?" Elias met his eyes, and the weight of his gaze was almost unbearable. "Because it's not just a bear. It's the result of a project that should never have existed. And if those men find you, they'll kill both of you to cover it up." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, leaving Jack reeling. He looked at Ghost, then back at Elias, his mind racing. "What kind of project?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. Elias hesitated, then said, "The kind that blurs the line between science and monstrosity." Ghost let out a low growl, as if responding to the revelation. Jack's grip on the axe tightened, and a new wave of fear washed over him. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the hunters, the truth about Ghost, or the fact that he was now inextricably tangled in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The fire crackled softly, its warmth cutting through the icy chill of the crevice. Jack stared at Elias, trying to process what he'd just heard. Ghost lay curled near the entrance, its massive body blocking most of the wind, but its ears twitched at every sound. The bear wasn't fully relaxed, and neither was Jack. "Start talking," Jack said, his voice firm. What kind of project are we dealing with? Elias poked the fire with his walking stick, his face grim. Years ago, a private research group, military-funded, of course, started an operation called Project Polaris. The idea was to push the limits of biological adaptation, to create creatures that could survive and operate in extreme conditions. The Arctic, the mountains, war zones. Anywhere humans couldn't? Jack's stomach churned. And Ghost? Is one of the last surviving specimens, Elias said. The experiments were unnatural. They weren't just enhancing animals, they were rewriting them, changing their DNA, merging it with traits from other species, testing resilience, strength, intelligence. Most of the subjects didn't survive. Jack glanced at Ghost, who was watching them intently now, as though it understood the conversation. The thought made his skin crawl. Why bears? Jack asked, his voice low. Elias shrugged. Bears are perfect candidates. Resilient, strong, natural survivors. And grizzlies, well, they're apex predators. But they didn't stop with bears. There were wolves, big cats, even some primates. All of them were subjected to genetic manipulation, endurance tests, surgical modifications. Ghost scar? That's not just an injury, it's a marker. It shows he was part of the program. Jack shook his head, disbelief washing over him. You're telling me the government created, what? Super animals? And now they're hunting them down? Not just the animals, Elias said, his eyes dark. Anyone who knows about them. They shut the program down years ago, but a few of the specimens escaped. Ghost must have been one of them. The hunters you ran into? They're cleaners. Their job is to eliminate anything that could tie back to Polaris. The weight of Elias's words pressed down on Jack, and he felt like the walls of the crevice were closing in. This wasn't just a survival situation anymore. It was a death sentence. Why are you telling me this? Jack demanded. Why are you here? Elias hesitated, then reached into his parka and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He handed it to Jack, who opened it cautiously. Inside were handwritten notes, sketches, and what looked like formulas and maps. Jack's eyes scanned the pages, confusion mounting. This is the truth, Elias said. Everything about Project Polaris. The experiments, the locations, the people involved. I was part of it, one of the lead researchers. I didn't realize how far it would go until it was too late. I've been trying to atone for it ever since. Jack's hands tightened on the notebook. You expect me to believe you're one of the good guys now? Elias met his gaze, unflinching. I don't care if you believe me. All I care about is making sure Ghost survives. He's proof of what they did, and he's more valuable alive than dead. But if you want to walk away, I won't stop you. Just know this, if they find you, they won't give you the option of walking away. Jack looked down at the notebook, his mind spinning. He thought about Sarah, about the guilt that had driven him to this mountain in the first place. He'd wanted to find meaning, to prove to himself that he wasn't a failure. Now he was faced with a choice that could cost him everything. Ghost let out a low growl, drawing Jack's attention. The bear's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Jack felt an unspoken connection. A shared understanding that they were both caught in something far bigger than themselves. Fine, Jack said, his voice steady. What's the plan? Elias's expression softened, and he nodded. We need to get off this mountain and find a safe location to regroup. There's a facility, one of the old Polaris labs, about 10 miles east of here. It's abandoned, but it should still have supplies and information we can use. 10 miles? Jack asked, his brow furrowing. In this terrain with those hunters on our trail? That's suicide. It's the only option, Elias said. And if we don't move soon, they'll find us. Trust me, staying here isn't an option. Jack looked at Ghost, who was already on its feet, its body tense and ready. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, but if this goes sideways, it's on you. Elias smirked. Fair enough. They packed quickly, each movement deliberate and efficient. Elias led the way, his knowledge of the terrain evident in the way he navigated the snow-covered landscape. Ghost followed closely behind, its presence both comforting and unnerving. Jack brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The first few hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional gust of wind. Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to the hunters, to the strange mix of fear and determination he'd felt during the fight. He wondered how far they were willing to go to erase the truth, and whether he had the strength to face them again. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and pink, they reached a narrow ravine. Elias stopped, his expression grave. "We'll camp here for the night," he said. "But we'll need to keep watch." "They're not far behind." Jack nodded, exhaustion tugging at his limbs. He dropped his pack and glanced at Ghost, who was sniffing the air, its ears alert. The bear's unease mirrored his own, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. "Get some rest," Elias said, settling onto a flat rock. "We'll need all the strength we can get tomorrow." Jack lay down beside Ghost, the bear's warmth a small comfort in the freezing night. As sleep claimed him, one thought echoed in his mind. What had he gotten himself into? The night was restless. Jack stirred constantly, his dreams haunted by flashes of Sarah's face, the sound of crunching snow, and the sharp crack of gunfire. Each time he opened his eyes, he found Ghost sitting alert, its gaze fixed on the entrance of their makeshift camp. The bear's presence felt both protective and foreboding, as though it knew danger was closing in. When dawn broke, the world was blanketed in a soft haze of gray. Snow continued to fall, erasing any footprints they had left behind but also obscuring their vision of the path ahead. Elias was already awake, studying the map he had spread out on a flat rock. His face was tense, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to move," he said without looking up. Jack sat up, stretching his stiff muscles. "Any sign of them?" Elias shook his head. "Not yet, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. The snow might buy us some time, but it works both ways. Visibility is low. We'll have to be careful." Ghost let out a low rumble, almost as if in agreement. Jack glanced at the bear, feeling a pang of unease. He still couldn't fully wrap his mind around the idea that this creature, this product of a twisted experiment, might be the key to something much bigger than himself. They packed up quickly, and within minutes, they were back on the trail. The terrain grew steeper, the snow deeper with each step. The cold bit at Jack's exposed skin, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't afford to think about his discomfort. Elias led the way, his movements deliberate and precise. Every so often he would stop to scan the horizon or check his compass, his expression growing more serious with each pause. Jack followed closely, his eyes darting nervously to the tree line. Ghost lumbered behind them, its massive paws silent on the snow. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the distant crack of ice shifting. The weight of their situation pressed down on Jack, making every step feel heavier than the last. His mind raced with questions he couldn't ask, fears he couldn't voice. As they approached a narrow ridge, Elias raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Jack froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "What is it?" he whispered. Elias didn't respond immediately. He crouched low, peering over the edge of the ridge. After a moment, he motioned for Jack to join him. Jack crept forward, careful not to make a sound. When he reached Elias's side, his stomach dropped. Below them, barely visible through the falling snow, were the hunters. There were 4 of them, their dark silhouettes cutting through the white landscape. They moved with military precision, their weapons slung across their backs. One of them knelt, studying the ground, while the others fanned out, their eyes scanning the area. "They're tracking us," Elias muttered. Jack felt his pulse quicken. "How far behind are they?" "Too close," Elias said grimly. "We need to lose them." He pointed to a jagged path that veered sharply to the east. "If we take that route, it'll slow them down. It's dangerous, but it might be our only chance." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. "Let's go." They descended the ridge carefully, their movements slow and deliberate. "Where are you watching this video from? Comment here, we want to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's go to history. The jagged path Elias had pointed out was treacherous, a narrow ledge that hugged the side of the mountain. One misstep could send them tumbling into the abyss below. Ghost navigated the path with surprising ease, its massive frame moving gracefully over the uneven terrain. Jack followed closely, his heart pounding with every step. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the faint sound of voices. "They're getting closer," Elias said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jack's grip on his ice axe tightened. He glanced back at Ghost, who was watching him intently, its dark eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. For a brief moment, he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let those hunters take Ghost, or him, without a fight. The ledge widened as they rounded a corner, revealing a small plateau. Elias motioned for them to stop and crouch down, pulling out a pair of binoculars. He scanned the ridge behind them, his expression grim. "They're moving faster than I thought," he said. "We don't have much time." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. A sudden noise, a sharp, metallic click, sent a chill down his spine. "Don't move," a voice barked. Jack turned slowly, his heart sinking. Standing at the edge of the plateau was one of the hunters, his rifle trained on them. "Drop the axe," the man said, his tone cold and commanding. Jack hesitated, his mind racing. Ghost let out a low growl, its body tensing as it prepared to pounce. "Do it," the hunter snapped. "Or I'll put a bullet in the bear." Jack's grip on the axe faltered. He glanced at Elias, whose face was pale but calm. "Do what he says," Elias said quietly. Reluctantly, Jack let the axe fall to the ground. The hunter smirked, taking a step closer. "Smart move," he said. Now, he didn't get to finish his sentence. Ghost lunged forward with a speed and ferocity that took everyone by surprise. The hunter barely had time to react before the bear was on him, its massive paws knocking the rifle from his hands. Chaos erupted. Elias grabbed Jack, pulling him toward the edge of the plateau. "Run," he shouted. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the path, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the sounds of the struggle echoed through the air, snarls, shouts, the crunch of snow beneath heavy bodies. Ghost caught up with them moments later, its fur matted with blood. Jack didn't stop to question whether it was the hunters or its own. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. When they finally stopped, Jack collapsed against a rock, gasping for breath. Elias crouched beside him, his face grim. "They'll keep coming," he said. "We need to reach the lab before it's too late." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know how much more of this he could take, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, carrying the metallic scent of blood and the lingering tension of their escape. Jack trudged forward, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he pushed on. Ghost lumbered behind, its massive frame battered but still moving, its dark eyes scanning the snowy horizon for any sign of further threats. Elias led the way, his movements brisk and purposeful. He seemed almost immune to exhaustion, though his face betrayed the weight of their journey. The narrow path finally opened into a snow-covered basin, and in the distance, Jack spotted the outline of a building, a stark, rectangular structure partially buried in ice. "That's it?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. Elias nodded. "It's been abandoned for years, but it should still have supplies. And answers." The word answers struck a chord in Jack. He wasn't sure if he was ready for them. As they approached, the building loomed larger, its concrete walls weathered and cracked. Icicles hung from the edges like jagged teeth, and snow had piled high against the sides, nearly obscuring the windows. Elias stopped at the entrance, brushing away layers of snow to reveal a keypad. "Will this even work?" Jack asked skeptically. Elias didn't respond. He typed a series of numbers with practiced precision, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the door slid open. Inside, the air was frigid, but at least it offered a reprieve from the relentless wind. The dim lighting flickered to life, casting long shadows across the walls. Jack followed Elias cautiously, Ghost padding silently beside him. The interior was a maze of hallways and rooms, most of them empty or filled with decaying equipment. Papers littered the floors, their edges yellowed and curling. Jack picked one up and scanned it, but the technical jargon was incomprehensible to him. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked. Elias stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked Secure Storage and turned to Jack. "Proof. Records of what they did here. And anything that can help us keep ghosts safe." Jack glanced at the bear, who was sniffing the air, its ears twitching. He felt a pang of unease. "And if we don't find anything?" Elias didn't answer. He entered another code into the keypad beside the door, and with a loud hiss, it slid open. The room beyond was different from the rest of the facility. Shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly labeled files and storage containers. In the center of the room, a glass enclosure housed a series of vials, their contents glowing faintly under the sterile light. Elias moved with purpose, pulling files from the shelves and spreading them out on a nearby table. Jack hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. Ghost stayed near the door, its massive frame almost too large for the cramped space. "Here," Elias said, shoving a folder toward Jack. "Read this." Jack opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. His stomach churned as he read about the experiments, how the animals had been subjected to genetic modifications, their DNA spliced with traits from other species. He read about endurance trials, neurological enhancements, and the chillingly clinical term disposal of failed subjects. "This is insane," Jack muttered, his hands trembling. Elias didn't look up. It was about control. About creating something that could survive where humans couldn't. But it got out of hand. "The things they did here," he trailed off, his voice thick with regret. Jack closed the folder and looked at Elias. "Why didn't you stop it?" Elias met his gaze, his eyes haunted. "Tried. But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. They had funding, power, and the willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. People like me were expendable." Jack felt a surge of anger. "And now we're cleaning up your mess?" Before Elias could respond, Ghost let out a low growl. The sound sent a chill down Jack's spine. "What is it?" he asked, turning toward the bear. Ghost was staring at the door, its body tense. Jack followed its gaze and froze. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. "They've found us," Elias whispered. Panic surged through Jack. "What do we do?" Elias grabbed a small device from one of the shelves and shoved it into Jack's hands. "Take this. It's a data drive with everything. Files, videos, logs. Proof of what they did here." Jack stared at the device, his mind racing. "What about you?" Elias pulled a pistol from his coat and chambered a round. "I'll hold them off. You get Ghost and get out of here." "No," Jack said firmly. "We're not leaving you." Elias shook his head. "This isn't about me. It's about stopping them. If you don't get that drive out of here, everything we've done will be for nothing." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of a gun being cocked cut him off. The first of the hunters appeared in the doorway, his weapon raised. "Move," Elias shouted, shoving Jack toward the back of the room. Jack stumbled, grabbing Ghost's fur for balance. The bear growled, its muscles coiling as it prepared to attack. "Go!" Elias shouted again, firing a shot at the hunter. Jack didn't think. He grabbed the drive and bolted, Ghost following close behind. The sound of gunfire echoed through the facility, mingling with shouts and growls. They ran through the maze of hallways, the icy air burning Jack's lungs. He didn't look back. He couldn't. When they burst out into the open, the blinding whiteness of the snow hit them like a wall. Jack stumbled but kept moving, his mind racing. Behind him, the sounds of the fight grew fainter, but his heart felt heavy. He didn't know if Elias would make it out alive, but one thing was certain. The truth couldn't die here. The biting cold enveloped Jack as he stumbled through the endless expanse of snow, the lab shrinking into the distance behind him. Ghost moved beside him, its massive frame providing a strange sense of protection amidst the emptiness. The adrenaline coursing through Jack's veins began to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of guilt. Elias was still in there, fighting for his life. Fighting for them. Jack clutched the data drive tightly in his hand, the small device feeling heavier than it should. He glanced at Ghost, who trudged silently beside him, its fur streaked with blood and ice. The bear's dark eyes met his, And for a moment, Jack swore he saw something human in its gaze: pain, understanding, and a shared sense of loss. They pushed forward, the wind howling around them like a living thing. The snow was relentless, blurring the horizon and making every step an ordeal. Jack's legs burned with exhaustion, and his fingers had gone numb long ago. Still, he couldn't stop. Not now. As they climbed a small ridge, Jack spotted a cluster of pine trees in the distance, their branches heavy with snow. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He forced himself to keep moving, each step fueled by the thought of what Elias had sacrificed for them. When they finally reached the trees, Jack collapsed against the trunk of the largest one, gasping for breath. Ghost stood nearby, its head swiveling as it scanned their surroundings. Jack pulled his coat tighter around him, trying to keep the cold at bay. The silence was deafening. For the first time since leaving the lab, Jack allowed himself to think about the files Elias had given him. He pulled the drive from his pocket and stared at it, the tiny device holding secrets that could change everything. He needed to know what was on it. Digging through his pack, Jack pulled out a rugged tablet Elias had insisted they bring. He powered it on, his hands trembling as he inserted the drive. The screen lit up, displaying a series of folders labeled with cryptic names: Project Genesis, Trial Reports, Subject Profiles. Jack hesitated before opening the first folder. The documents inside were a mix of technical data, photographs, and videos. He clicked on one of the videos, his stomach churning as it began to play. The footage was grainy but clear enough to make out a sterile lab filled with cages. Inside them were animals, wolves, bears, and creatures Jack couldn't even identify. Their eyes glowed unnaturally, their movements erratic and unnatural. A voice spoke off camera, cold and detached. Subject 7 demonstrates enhanced cognitive function and motor skills. Aggression levels remain high but manageable. Proceeding with Phase 3 trials, the camera zoomed in on one of the cages, and Jack's heart nearly stopped. Inside was a younger version of Ghost, its eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. He closed the video, unable to watch any more. Before he could open another file, Ghost let out a low growl, its body tensing. Jack froze, his eyes darting to the edge of the tree line. He heard it then, a faint crunch of snow. They weren't alone. Jack scrambled to his feet, shoving the tablet back into his pack. He grabbed a nearby branch, gripping it like a makeshift weapon. Ghost stepped in front of him, its massive frame shielding Jack as the sounds grew closer. From the shadows, a figure emerged, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Don't shoot," the person said, their voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around their face. Jack narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on the branch. "Who are you?" The stranger pulled down the scarf, revealing a young woman with wind-burned cheeks and piercing green eyes. Her face was etched with exhaustion, but her gaze was sharp and unyielding. "My name's Tessa," she said. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jack didn't lower the branch. "How do I know that?" Tessa glanced at Ghost, her expression softening. "Because if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have come alone. And I wouldn't have approached you like this." Jack hesitated, studying her. She didn't look like one of the hunters, but that didn't mean he could trust her. "What do you want?" he asked. Tessa took a cautious step closer. "I know what you have. The drive. The files. I've been looking for that proof for years." Jack's stomach sank. "How do you know about it?" Tessa hesitated, her gaze flickering to Ghost. "Because I used to work for them. I was part of the team that created Ghost." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. "You're one of them?" "No," Tessa said quickly. "Not anymore. I left when I realized what they were doing. I've been trying to expose them ever since." Jack shook his head, his mind racing. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I can help you," Tessa said, her voice steady. "I know how to decrypt the files. I know how to use them to bring down the people who did this." Jack glanced at Ghost, who was watching Tessa intently. The bear didn't seem hostile, but it also didn't seem entirely at ease. "You don't have much of a choice," Tessa added. "They're coming for you. And if you want to survive, you're going to need all the help you can get." Jack hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay on guard. But deep down, he knew she was right. He couldn't do this alone. Fine, he said reluctantly. But if you try anything, I won't, Tessa interrupted. I want the same thing you do. To stop them? Jack nodded, though the knot of distrust in his chest didn't loosen. Then let's move. We can't stay here. As they set off into the snow, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with the devil. But for now, it was a risk he had to take. The journey through the wilderness became an uneasy truce. Jack kept his distance from Tessa, his eyes flickering to her every few steps. Ghost stayed between them, an unspoken barrier, its massive paws crunching through the snow in a steady rhythm. Tessa tried to break the silence. You don't trust me. I get it. But you should know, I walked away from them because I couldn't stand what they were doing anymore. The experiments, the lies, it wasn't what I signed up for. Jack snorted, his breath visible in the icy air. And now you're suddenly the hero? Forgive me if I'm not convinced. Tessa didn't respond immediately. She adjusted her pack and stared straight ahead. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to stop them, same as you. The tension between them was palpable, but Jack couldn't afford to dwell on it. The storm was intensifying, and the cold was relentless. They needed shelter, and they needed it fast. They pressed on until they reached a narrow ravine, the walls of ice and rock offering some protection from the wind. Jack spotted a small cave entrance near the base of the cliff and gestured toward it. This'll have to do for now, he said, his voice clipped. The cave was shallow but provided enough space for the three of them. Jack built a small fire while Ghost settled near the entrance, its dark eyes scanning the snowy landscape. Tessa sat across from Jack, her hands outstretched toward the flickering flames. Jack pulled the tablet from his pack and placed it between them. If you really want to help, show me what you know. Tessa nodded, her expression serious. She leaned forward, her fingers dancing across the screen as she navigated the files. These folders contain everything we need: trial data, funding records, internal communications. But they're heavily encrypted. Without the right codes, it could take weeks to crack them. Jack frowned. Do you have the codes? Tessa hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Not all of them. But I know where we can find them. Where? There's a secondary facility, further north, Tessa said. It was used as a backup archive. If we can get inside, we'll have access to everything we need to expose them. Jack's stomach twisted. The idea of walking into another one of their labs made his skin crawl. And what happens if they're waiting for us? You expect me to just walk into a trap? It's a risk, Tessa admitted. But it's the only way. Without those codes, the files are useless. Jack leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. Every instinct told him to stay far away from anything connected to the people who had created Ghost. But the drive in his pack felt like a ticking time bomb, its contents too important to leave untouched. Before he could respond, Ghost let out a low growl. Jack's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The bear's ears were pricked, its body tense. What is it? Jack whispered. Tessa reached for her pack, pulling out the small pistol. We're not alone. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows against the cave walls. Jack strained to listen, but all he could hear was the howl of the wind. Then, faintly, came the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. Stay back, Jack said, grabbing a branch he had sharpened into a makeshift spear. Ghost moved to the entrance of the cave, its massive frame blocking the way. Jack and Tessa followed cautiously, their weapons raised. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, out of the blizzard, figures emerged. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark tactical gear. Their faces were obscured by masks, but the weapons they carried were unmistakable. Jack Matthews, one of them called, his voice distorted by a helmet. We know you're in there. Hand over the bear and the data, and we'll let you live. Jack's grip on the spear tightened. Not happening. The man sighed, raising his weapon. Then we'll do this the hard way. Before Jack could react, Tessa stepped forward, her hands raised. Wait, she shouted. Jack's heart dropped. What are you doing? Tessa ignored him, addressing the soldiers. You're here for the bear and the drive, right? Let me go, and I'll tell you where they are. What the hell, Tessa? Jack hissed, his voice shaking with rage. Tessa turned to him, her expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Jack. But this is bigger than you or me. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe he had let himself trust her, even for a second. The lead soldier nodded. Deal. Tell us where they are and you're free to go. Tessa pointed toward the ravine. They were heading west, toward the old ranger station. If you hurry, you can catch them. The soldiers exchanged glances, then lowered their weapons. Let's move, the leader said, gesturing for his team to follow. As they disappeared into the storm, Tessa turned back to Jack, her face pale. They won't find us here. I bought us time. Jack's anger boiled over. You lied to them? Tessa nodded, her expression grim. I did what I had to do. If they thought we were here, we'd be dead already. Jack stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. Ghost let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on Tessa. Jack didn't know if it was anger or warning, but he felt the same unease. For now, they were safe. But the fragile alliance between them had been shattered, and Jack knew trust wouldn't come easily again. Get some rest, Tessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. We leave at first light? Jack didn't respond. He sat by the fire, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Betrayal, lies, and survival. The lines between ally and enemy had never been more blurred. Dawn broke in muted shades of gray, the storm having quieted but leaving a thick blanket of snow behind. Jack didn't sleep. He sat near the smoldering remnants of the fire, the weight of Tessa's betrayal still gnawing at him. Ghost lay nearby, its body a silent sentinel, though its ears flicked at every subtle sound. Tessa stirred, stretching as she emerged from the shallow cave. Her face was drawn, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleeplessness. We need to move, she said, her voice soft but firm. Jack didn't respond immediately. He stood and packed up their few supplies, his movements mechanical. Ghost rose to its feet, shaking the snow from its fur. Without a word, they set off toward the secondary facility Tessa had mentioned. The path was treacherous, the snow deep and uneven. Jack kept his focus on the horizon, the icy air burning his lungs. Tessa walked a few steps behind, her silence doing little to bridge the growing chasm between them. Hours passed before they reached their destination. The facility was hidden in the shadow of a jagged mountain, its angular structure partially buried under layers of ice and snow. It looked abandoned, but Jack knew better than to trust appearances. This is it, Tessa said, stopping a few feet away from the entrance. The backup archive is inside. If we can get to it, we'll have everything we need. Jack turned to her, his eyes narrowing. And what's stopping them from tracking us down the second we step in there? Tessa hesitated, then pulled a small device from her pack. I managed to steal this before I left. It scrambles their tracking systems. It won't last forever, but it should give us enough time. Jack didn't hide his skepticism, but he nodded. Let's get this over with. They entered the facility cautiously, Ghost leading the way. The air inside was stale, and the flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. Jack's boots crunched on the icy floor as they made their way deeper into the building. The main archive room was a fortress of technology. Rows of servers hummed faintly, their lights blinking like stars in the dimly lit space. Tessa moved quickly, plugging the tablet into one of the terminals. This is going to take a while, she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Jack kept his weapon ready, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. Ghost stood near the door, its massive frame tense and alert. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Tessa worked in silence, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Jack's patience wore thin, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. Almost there, Tessa said finally, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Just a few more minutes. Jack's relief was short-lived. A distant sound echoed through the facility, the unmistakable hum of engines. They're here, Jack said, his grip tightening on his weapon. Tessa's hands flew faster. I need more time. Jack glanced at Ghost, who let out a low growl, its ears pinned back. We don't have time. Finish what you can and let's go. Tessa shook her head, her voice rising in panic. If I don't decrypt this now, we'll lose everything. The engines grew louder, followed by the metallic clatter of boots on the icy floor. Jack's heart pounded as he moved to the doorway, his eyes searching the shadows. Ghost let out a warning roar, its body crouching as if ready to attack. Jack turned to Tessa. "We have to move." "I'm almost there," she snapped, her voice frantic. Before Jack could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness, weapon raised. Jack reacted instinctively, throwing himself to the side as a shot rang out, the bullet sparking against the metal wall. Ghost charged, its massive form colliding with the soldier in a blur of fur and claws. The man screamed, but the sound was short-lived. More soldiers poured into the room, their weapons firing in rapid succession. Jack ducked behind a console, returning fire with his makeshift spear and anything he could grab. "Tessa, we're out of time," he shouted. "I just need 10 seconds, she yelled back, her voice shaking. Jack gritted his teeth, his focus split between the soldiers and the countdown in his mind. Ghost fought with savage precision, its roars echoing through the room as it took down one attacker after another. Finally, Tessa shouted, "I've got it." She ripped the tablet from the terminal and bolted toward Jack, the soldiers closing in. Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. Ghost fell in step beside them, its fur matted with blood. The three of them raced through the facility, the sound of gunfire and shouts fading behind them. When they burst into the open air, the cold hit Jack like a wall, but he didn't stop. They ran until the facility was a distant speck on the horizon, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Only then did they collapse in the snow, the tablet clutched tightly in Tessa's hands. Jack turned to her, his voice raw. "Tell me you got what we need." Tessa nodded, her face pale but determined. "Everything. Their experiments, their funding sources, their key players. It's all here." Jack leaned back, his chest heaving. For the first time, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. But as he looked at Tessa, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Her betrayal in the cave, her sudden access to a scrambler, her insistence on staying behind just a little longer, it didn't add up. He turned to Ghost, whose dark eyes were fixed on Tessa. The bear's instincts had saved them before, and Jack had learned to trust them. As the storm began to pick up again, Jack realized their fight wasn't over. They had the evidence, but the danger was far from behind them. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest threat might still be among them. Jack, Tessa, and Ghost were hiding in a cabin in the frozen desert while the world was in turmoil over the revelations that had leaked. Gentek's data had been anonymously published, exposing inhumane experiments and illegal operations. The media was in a frenzy, and protests were erupting all over the country. As Jack stared at the fireplace, he felt that the mission was far from over. He knew Gentek wouldn't fall so easily. Tessa, sitting in silence, seemed more distant than ever. Jack finally broke the silence. "Did you tell me everything?" Tessa hesitated, her breath uneven. "I did what I had to do to survive." "But yes, Jack, it's all of it." Ghost, standing next to Jack, growled softly, as if sensing something. Jack stared at Tessa, the bond of trust they had rebuilt still fragile. "If you lied," he began, but she interrupted him. "I didn't lie. But even if you have doubts, we need to keep going. They'll still come after us." Jack looked at Ghost, who was staring at him as if he understood. He stood up, determined. "Then let's finish this." With Ghost by his side and Tessa in his shadow, Jack prepared to face whatever came next. The fight for the truth had just begun. If you've made it this far, comment, frozen, like, share. This will help us a lot. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.